What's up, YouTube? This is 82 and 0. Welcome back. So, who is Arnold Red Auerbach? He was born September 20th, 1917. And in my opinion, a lot of people will disagree on this, especially nowadays. He's kind of been lost in time. I think he has a good argument to be considered the greatest coach of all time. Sometimes people will say Phil Jackson. Sometimes people will say Greg Popovich, which I'm a little biased there as a Spurs fan. And it's always hard to rank a coach because the only criteria you can judge them on is if they won. And you could have an innovative coach with hundreds of plays and forward style thinking and put him on a horrible team with no talent, and you're going to say he's a trash coach because the team doesn't do well. So it's sometimes really hard to rank coaches. But I think the criteria on how you look past just the wins is you look at the innovations they bring. Because part of being a coach is bringing out the best in your players. Figuring out schemes that may not have been done before, or figuring out the system, So, Red Auerbach, he was one of four children born to Mary and Hyman Auerbach. Now, they were Russian Jewish immigrants. So, for a lot of people who don't know, Russia had a pretty big Jewish population, particularly like Ashkenazi people, which is an ethnic group in Eastern Europe, which are predominantly Jewish. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the early 1900s in the Soviet Union, Russia, whatever you want to call it. And many families left. And Red Auerbach's father left Russia when he was only 13 years old. And, this is a really bad time to come to America because it was the Great Depression. And Red's nickname was Red because of his red hair. A lot of people don't realize this because he had the white hair as a coach when we knew him. But when he was young, he had really red hair and he had a fiery temper. And growing up in the Great Depression, he actually played basketball. I don't think a lot of people realize this. He played point guard, and he played at PS 122, which is in the Eastern District High School, where he was named second team All-Brooklyn by the World Telegram in his senior year. After a season with Seth Low Junior College, Auerbach received an athletic scholarship to a basketball program and Bill Reinhardt at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Auerbach was a standout basketball player and graduated with an M.A. in 1941. In those years, Auerbach began to understand the importance of the fast break and how potent charging attackers against two backpedaling defenders could be. This might sound really weird to people in 2022 because everybody knows what a fast break is. But the thing about basketball I'm talking pre-NBA. Games were very, even before the NBA, there was the NBL, right? Games were very low scoring back in those days. And they didn't have a lot of fast running gun offense. And I sometimes hear people mistakenly will say that was the way it was in the 60s too, but no. The 60s was the fastest paced era in basketball history, even without the three-point line. And a lot of this was because of the fast break revolution. So, Auerbach, in the inaugural BAA season, which is what would become the NBA, Auerbach led a fast break-oriented team built around the BAA star Bones McKinley, who actually, fun fact, is Elgin Baylor's favorite player growing up. and various ex-Navy players to a 49-11 win-loss record, including a standard-setting 17-game win streak. That would actually stand until the record was broken in 1969. In the playoffs, however, they were defeated by the Chicago Stags in 6 games. The next year, his Washington Capitals went 28-20, but were eliminated from the playoffs in 1-game Western Divisional tiebreaker. In the 1948-49 BAA season, the Caps won their first 15 games and finished the season at 38-22. The team reached the BAA finals but were beaten by the Minneapolis Lakers, led by George Mikan. Now, in the next season, the BAA rival league, the NBL, would merge and become the NBA. And Auerbach felt he had to rebuild his squad. However, the team's owner didn't really want to bring Auerbach back. And Auerbach would leave the Washington Capitals and became the assistant coach at the Duke Blue Devils men's basketball team. And during the time, people thought Red Auerbach would take over for head coach Gary Gurrid, who was battling cancer during his tenure at Duke. Auerbach regularly worked with the future All-American Dick Groke. Auerbach later wrote he felt pretty bad waiting for Jared to die, and that was no way to get a job. And Auerbach left Duke because of this. He didn't feel right in his conscience to just sit around and wait for someone to die to get the job. That sounds pretty bad. And he would leave Duke. The owner, at the time, there was a team in the NBA called the Tri-City Blackhawks. They gave him the green light to rebuild the team from scratch. Auerbach traded more than 24 players in just 6 weeks. And the revamped Blackhawks improved by the end of the 49-50 NBA season, with a losing record of 28-29. When Kerner traded Auerbach's favorite player, this infuriated Auerbach. Also in 1950, Auerbach took positions as an athletic director at Cushers Hotel in Catskills, New York. And he actually held summer basketball leagues there, which I'll get into in a minute why that's important. So prior to the 1951 NBA season, Walter Brown, who was the original owner of the Boston Celtics, he was pretty desperate to turn his team around. And the team itself wasn't really doing too well financially. They had a 22-46 record, and back in those days, a team could fold if they weren't careful. And the owner, Walter Brown, didn't know much about coaching. To him, it was just a business endeavor to be owner. He didn't really know how to run a team, how to coach a team. And in the 1958, so they selected Auerbach to be their coach. And in the 1950 draft, Auerbach made some notable moves. The first move he did was he got Bob Cousy in the 1950 draft. And this infuriated Boston. They argued that the flashy Cousy was not a team player. And they thought, this might sound pretty crazy, they thought Cousy's play style was too flashy. And they thought it would decrease the team morale. And he also drafted Chuck Cooper, who was the first black player to be drafted in the NBA. And Auerbach famously said when they drafted Bill Russell later, said, I don't care if they're purple. The guy I draft is going to play. So he had some forward thinking in that he didn't care who he was going to draft. It didn't matter to him what color they were, where they're from. Now, in the following 1951-52 season, Auerbach made a remarkable draft pick of the future Hall of Famer Bill Sharman. So this created a dynamic duo of Bill Sharman and Bob Cousy during the early 50s. And Auerbach, I'll get into it a little more later, but he was not only a great coach, but he had a good mind at drafting players. Um, but they couldn't really get it done in the early 50s. But before the 1956 NBA draft, Auerbach had already set his sights on Bill Russell. And it was just a matter of figuring out how to get Bill Russell. And they made an offer to the Hawks where they would trade, McCauley and a rookie Cliff Hagan to the St. Louis Hawks for Bill Russell. And during the time, this was met with a lot of criticism because the city of Boston is notorious for being a racist city. And many fans protested drafting Bill Russell. But Auerbach stood by him. And he also picked up, Tom Heinsohn and Casey Jones, who are also two future Hall of Famers. So now you have Casey Jones, you have Bill Sharman, you have Bob Cousy, you have Tom Heinsohn, and you got Bill Russell. And I would bore you guys if I just went off telling you about all the championships they won. They won more than any other dynasty in NBA history. And what made this team so great is they were anchored by their defense. Believe it or not, okay, the Celtics themselves, for the most part, they didn't really have really good offensive ratings. I could be wrong when I say this, but I'm pretty sure this is right to say they never had the number one rated offense in any of their championships years, but they were always the number one rated defense. And Bill Russell made it a vertical game. So his strategy was block the ball to his teammate, start the fast break, or get the rebound, throw it off to Cousy and Sharman. And they revolutionized basketball with this elite fast break distributor of Cousy throwing the outlet passes from Russell. Yeah, or their alley-oop plays, So they won in 57, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66. These are all of Auerbach's championships as a coach. And he would eventually step down as a coach. And Bill Russell would get the coaching job. But one thing I got to mention is, while he was coaching, they were building a good team for the long haul. They early on they had guys like Frank Ramsey, who was a sixth man, and John Havlicek, and later Don Nelson. So this might sound crazy today, because everybody knows you need a good sixth man, but believe it or not, okay, in those days, teams would play their starters, like 40, 42 minutes. And the bench players, you barely played any minutes. So one strategy that Auerbach had, which is so common sense today, but innovative for the time, is we can have a guy come off the bench and torture the other team's second unit. And early on it was Frank Ramsey, but John Havlicek was way better at this role because Havlicek could play the point. He could distribute, he could play shooting guard, he could play a small bar power forward even if he wanted to, or small forward. So they'd have him come off the bench and, they'd be able to periodically rest starters while keeping Havlicek in. And he was just too athletic for other teams' second unit, just torching them. And it was just devastating to their opposition. Like I said, from 1957 to 1966, the Celtics won 9 of 10 championships. This included 8 consecutive championships, which is the longest champion streak in North American sports history. Following Auerbach's emphasis on teamwork, what was also striking about his teams was that they never seemed to have a dominant scorer. You know, there would be, like, for example, in the 65 season, or, Sam Jones would have 25 points per game. That'd be their leading scorer, but they'd also have guys with like 18, 19 points. It wasn't necessarily about who could score the most, it was about team basketball. And in 1961, for example, the Celtics had 6 players who scored between 15 and 21 points per game, but none made the top 10 scoring list. And in 1964, he was actually the first one to have an all-black starting 5, where they had Casey Jones at the point, Sam Jones at the shooting guard. I think they had Willie Nelson at small forward, Tom Sanders at power forward, and Bill Russell at center. This was the first all-black starting 5. Auerbach would go a step further in the 1967 season when he stepped down and gave the coaching job to Bill Russell, which Bill Russell became the first black coach in professional sports history, at least North American sports histories. And he didn't stop being instrumental in the Celtics. I mean, from 1966 to 1984, he was the GM for the Celtics. So he put Bill Russell in as coach, and they would go on and win a championship in 68 and 69. Auerbach then rebuilt the Celtics with draft picks and Dave Cowens and JoJo White, as well as Paul Westville and Don Chaney. So this is something that doesn't really get talked about with Auerbach, is he was really able to find diamonds in the rough, like Sam Jones, for example, or a John Havlicek, or an aging Willie Knowles. He was able to, get some good use out of him. And he was very good at rebuilding teams. And in the 70s, they'd win 2 titles with this core I told you about. Dave Cowens, JoJo White, John Havlicek was still on the team. And this time they had Tom Heinsohn as their coach. Now, however, the Celtics would go into a slump in the late 70s. And, a lot of people thought, this is it for the Celtics. Okay, they had a good run, but Havlicek's going to be gone. And they end up getting Larry Bird. And he makes a lot of smart moves. He gets Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale. And they rebuild this team for the late 70s, 79, 80. And in the summer of 78, I think is when it really turned around for the Celtics. Like I said, they got Larry Bird, who in the early 80s, a lot of people said he was the greatest player they'd ever seen. And they ended up winning 3 championships in the 80s. And, one thing is, although Bird was drafted in 78, he didn't actually officially come into the 79-80 season because he wanted to do one more year at college. But he was the highest paid rookie in NBA history with a $650,000 per year deal. Auerbach knew the brilliant, hardworking Bird would be the cornerstone of a new Celtics generation. And like I said, he pulled some smart moves. He got Robert Parrish from the Golden State Warriors for practically a bag of peanuts. He got Kevin McHale in the draft. But two other smart things I think he did was In 1983, Auerbach named the Celtics player Casey Jones from the 60s, as the new starting coach. And he was a great coach for that team, giving them a championship in 84 and 86. But one thing I think that he did was really smart, like what he did earlier, is he found aging players and got the best out of them. Like Bill Walton, for example, who was a former MVP, who was just a shell of himself and had all these surgeries on his feet. He couldn't play for the life of him. Couldn't stay healthy. And Auerbach convinced him to, he got him over to the Celtics, right? And the story I heard is the doctors were in there with Auerbach and Bill Walton for his physical. And the doctors said, you're not going to be in playing shape. You're not going to be able to play. And Auerbach, was smoking a cigar in the doctor's office, despite them asking him to put it out. And Auerbach said, Bill, do you feel like you can play? And Bill Walton said, yeah. And a good story about this is Bill Walton and Larry Bird spent a lot of time together before the season. And Larry Bird took Bill Walton to his childhood home down in French Lick, Indiana. And he saw the humble beginning that Bird had, with that dirt road court that he had. And he took some of the dirt and put it in a jar. And the story goes, through the season, whenever Walton felt like he was going to get hurt or he was nervous, because Walton battled a lot of depression from his injuries. Whenever he felt like something was going to go wrong, he would take that dirt out, like just a smidgen of it, and rub it on his forehead. And that was actually his healthiest season he ever had. He played 80 of 82 games, and he won Sixth Man of the Year. Unfortunately, though, after Auerbach was gone, the Celtics had two tragedies, losing Len Bias and Reggie Lewis. Otherwise, I think they could have very well probably won a title in the 90s. But that's Red Auerbach's story. He was known for his cigar smoking. He would light up wherever he was at. And he was known for his love of Chinese food. He had a Chinese restaurant while he was coach. And he would feed his NBA players, when they'd travel, Chinese food. I bet a lot of you didn't know that. So, he lived a really long life. He actually died of a heart attack on October 28th, 2006 at the age of 89. The then NBA commissioner, who's now deceased himself, David Stern, said, "The void that his death would cause will never be filled." And players like Bill Russell, Casey Jones, John Havlicek, and Larry Bird were all contemporaries, like Jerry West to Pat Riley and Wayne Embry. And during the 2006-2007 season, NBA TV and NBA.com aired reruns of Auerbach's 4-minute instructional videos called Red on the Round Ball, previously aired on NBA on CBS halftime shows in the 1970s and 80s, which I'd encourage you guys to look that up. And prior to Boston's season opener against the Wizards, his signature was officially placed on a parquet floor near the center court, thereby naming that court as Red Auerbach Parquet Floor. The ceremony was attended by his daughter Randy and some of the Celtics legends. The signature replaced the Red Auerbach Memorial logo used in the 2007 season, which was just a clover that said red. So that's the legacy he left behind. Is he the greatest coach of all time? If you don't think so, that's fine. But you have to at least admit he was one of the most innovative coaches of all time. And let's talk about his accolades, right? So as his career as a coach, he won 66% of his games, winning 938 games, losing 479. He had 9 championships. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1969 as a coach. And he was actually inducted into the Hall of Fame as an executive, too. So that's Red Auerbach's story. Let me know what you guys think down below. Thanks for watching.